Hello and welcome to Starbound's second channel. My name is Gabriel the Bibi Capaldi and I'll be your narrator today. But before we get into today's story, please do check down below that you are subscribed to the channel. It's 100% free and helps us pop up on your feed a bit more often. Ludar had witnessed countless species across the galaxy showcase their evolutionary advantages. The Furak with their pack-hunting precision, the Garar with their unmatched physical strength. But in his 237 cycles of existence, nothing had prepared him for humanity's baffling ability to tame the untamable. Looking back, he should have recognized the warning signs the first time he saw the human, carrying nothing but a single rifle, a pair of strange binoculars, and a backpack of unknown contents. Yet Lordar's mind was elsewhere, as the Council ship's landing struts sank into the soft loom of Yogana's surface. He pressed his face against the viewport. His elongated green fingers splayed across the transparent material. His serpentine eyes, with their horizontal slit pupils, dilated to adjust to the strange light as he studied the crimson forest that surrounded their clearing. The red leaves swayed in the alien breeze, creating undulating waves that seemed almost deliberate in their movement. Something about this planet made the delicate scales covering his slender body itch beneath his formal council attire. Some kind of predatory energy.
Sir, all systems report safe atmospheric conditions,
the pilot announced, his voice coming from a communications panel adorned with the 16-pointed star of the Galactic Council. Lordar's inner eyelids moved nervously as he pulled away from the viewport, a translucent membrane sliding horizontally across his eyelids before retracting.
Very well. Begin disembarking procedures and notify the hunters that briefing will commence in 30 minutes.
As protocol dictated, Lordar was the first to exit the vessel. Above, a yellow sun cast shadows across the clearing. The light filtering through the crimson canopy bathed everything in a disconcerting, blood-red glow, making the delicate ridges along Lordar's cranium move with unease. Perfect environment for apex predators, he thought grimly. Perfect environment for the Gronax. The group of contracted hunters descended the ramp behind him. First came the Furak team, 8 pack-hunting beings with thick fur in varying shades of grey, moving with unsettling synchronicity. Unlike most canines, they walked upright on powerful hind legs, their forelimbs ending in dexterous 5-digited paws. Their leader, Egak, surveyed the terrain with amber eyes set in a long muzzle filled with serrated teeth designed for tearing flesh.
The scent is right here,
Egak noted, his voice a rumbling growl that somehow formed perfect galactic standard.
Many prey species, many opportunities.
The other Furak sniffed the air in unison, their curved ears swiveling independently to catch every sound in the alien forest. Next came the Garar mercenaries, their heavy boots clanking against the metal ramp. Each stood nearly twice Lordar's height. Their leathery hides, crisscrossed with scars, they displayed as proudly as the formidable weapons strapped to their massive frames. Their skin ranged from molten green to deep brown, with bony plates protruding along their shoulders and spines.
"Too much plant life,"
Hatir rumbled, his voice so deep it seemed to vibrate the ground beneath them. His lower tusks protruded from his jaw, clicking against his upper teeth as he spoke.
"Limits lines of fire. Will need to create clearings."
The casual mention of environmental destruction made Lordar's stomach acids churn, but he knew better than to lecture a Garar about conservation protocols. And then, almost as an afterthought, came the human. Elias Garcia descended the ramp with an easy stride that seemed unfit to the gravity of their mission. Unlike the other hunters, who bristled with weapons and protective gear, the human appeared almost casual. His skin seemed impossibly soft and vulnerable compared to the armored hides and protective fur of the other hunters. No claws, no natural armor, no enhanced senses that Lordar could discern, just 2 forward-facing eyes, dull, omnivore teeth, and a frame that appeared fragile next to the towering Garar. His single rifle seemed inadequate compared to the Garra's arsenal. Those strange binoculars hung around his neck, and the mysterious backpack was slung carelessly over one shoulder. Lordar felt his stomach acids churning with anxiety, the specialized organ beneath his ribcage contracting painfully. The Central Council's decision to include a human in this hunting expedition had baffled him from the start. Humans were not known as hunters in the galactic community. They were traders, diplomats, and occasionally scientists, soft-skinned creatures from a gentle homeworld who had somehow managed to secure a seat at the galactic table through clever negotiation rather than strength. Yet, here one stood, whistling softly and scanning the Crimson Forest with interest rather than caution.
All hunters must report to the conference room in the secondary ship. 20 minutes.
Lordar announced, his voice pitched higher than he intended. The minutes crawled by as he prepared, reviewing the mission details and steadying his nerves. When the team arrived, he entered the ship and stepped into the conference room, where tension thickened the air like an impending storm. The gathered hunters stood around the 3D display, their predatory gazes sharp and unreadable. Lordar took his place at the head of the table, close to the group of Furaks.
The Central Council appreciates your prompt response to our contract offer,
he began, his green skin flushing slightly darker with nervousness. His fingers fidgeted with the control panel as he spoke.
As you've been preliminarily informed, we face a significant threat to the promising pre-spaceflight civilization on Yogana.
The 3D display activated, showing aerial footage of a mass reptilian creature soaring over the Crimson Forest. Its wingspan stretched wider than the Council ship itself. Leathery membranes connected elongated digits. Acid dipped from enormous fangs, sizzling through vegetation below. Even in the grainy footage, the intelligence gleaming in its eyes was unmistakable.
The Gronax,
Lordar continued,
an apex predator that has begun hunting dangerously close to settlements of indigenous population. The Council has voted unanimously for its extermination to preserve the natural development of Yoganan civilization.
Egak leaned forwards, ears pricked with interest, his clawed hands flexing on the table surface.
One creature, not a population. Our surveys indicate this is a solitary individual,
Ludar confirmed.
Likely a mature male seeking new territory in a new continent. However, its size and capabilities make it exceptionally dangerous.
Hatir snorted, the sound rumbling from deep in his massive chest, vibrating the fluid in a decorative vial hanging from Lordar's neck.
Nothing is too dangerous for Garra hunters. We have eliminated threats twice this size on worlds far more hostile.
Lordar noticed the human, Elias, studying the 3D projection with unusual intensity, his expression thoughtful rather than intimidated. While the Furak and Garra postures screamed dominance and aggression, the human simply leaned forward with his elbows on the table, chin resting on interlaced fingers, a posture that, in his species, apparently indicated deep concentration.
The Council has structured this as a competitive contract,
Lordar explained.
Each species will independently scout for 3 days, then present elimination plans. The team with the most effective strategy will receive the full contract payment. Others will be compensated for time spent.
A waste of resources.
Hatir growled, a ridge of spines along his massive forearm rising in irritation.
My team could eliminate this threat before the next sunset.
Egak bared his teeth in what might have been a smile. though no Galactic Council species ever interpreted canid teeth displays as friendly.
Perhaps the Council remembers the Garar's last hasty elimination on Zahar, the one that resulted in the extinction of 3 non-target species.
His pack members emitted synchronized low growls, their fur bristling along their spines in an attempt to intimidate Hetir. Hetir's hand slowly moved towards his weapon, the movement causing the armor plates on his shoulder to shift and click together, and Lordar hurriedly continued, stepping between the two hunter groups.
"The competition format stands,"
he said, forcing authority into his voice despite the stress constricting his breathing tubes.
3 days of reconnaissance, after which we reconvene to evaluate approaches.
Throughout the escalating tension, the human remained silent, occasionally jotting notes in a small paper booklet, another peculiarity when all others used standard data pads. Lordar found himself increasingly discomforted by the human's presence. The other hunters, at least, behaved predictably.
"Any questions before teams collect their equipment?"
Lordar asked, eager to conclude the briefing before hostilities escalated further. "Yes," Elias spoke for the first time, his voice unexpectedly resonant in the tense room. "The footage shows evidence of territorial markings through acid secretion. Has anyone catalogued the chemical composition?" The question caught Lordar off guard.
Well, no. The priority was evacuation for research personnel once the Gronax was identified."
He noticed how the human's question immediately diffused the tension between the Furak and the Garar, as both groups turned their attention to this puzzling inquiry. Elias nodded, making another note in his peculiar paper book with what appeared to be a primitive graphite writing implement. Egak's ears flattened against his skull, and the fur along his neck stood on end.
"What uses chemical composition to a hunter? You track, you corner, you kill."
"Different approaches for different species," Elias replied with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, a diplomatic non-answer that revealed nothing of his actual strategy. Hetir stood abruptly, towering over the table. The bony plates along his spine clicked together as he straightened to his full intimidating height.
Enough talk. Time for action.
The other Garar followed suit, the movement a not-so-subtle display of physical dominance, each standing with weapons prominently displayed.
"Dismissed,"
Lordar said hastily, retracting himself to appear smaller and less threatening, a natural response of his species to potential conflict.
"Equipment distribution in the cargo bay."
The loading bay became a theater of competitive display as each hunting team collected their gear. The Furak moved as a single organism, each member instinctively handling specific equipment for the group. The Garar, by contrast, were a thunderstorm of activity, loud, intimidating, and destructive. They hefted massive weapons designed more for overwhelming force than precision, the heavy artillery making Lordar flinch as metal scraped against metal. And then there was Elias Garcia. The human had claimed a small corner of the bay where he methodically unpacked what appeared to be tiny mechanical devices from his mysterious backpack. His movements were economical, almost meditative. As he calibrated each one and set it aside, Lordar noticed the human lacked both the pack coordination of the Furak and the intimidating presence of the Garar, yet worked with a focused mind that somehow commanded attention.
"What are those little toys?"
Egak called from the distance, his tone mockingly curious, his amber eyes narrowing as he evaluated the strange devices.
"Souvenirs to remember your failure?"
Elias looked up with that same enigmatic smile. "Just some drones, eyes and ears, you know?" He held up one of the devices, barely larger than his palm, with 4 tiny rotors and what appeared to be a sophisticated sensory array.
Real hunters use their own senses,
one of Egak's packmates growled, his entire body tensing as if the very suggestion of technological assistance was offensive to his hunting instincts. Real hunters use whatever works, Elias replied mildly, continuing his preparations without apparent concern. By mid-afternoon, the hunting teams were departing into different sections of the Crimson Forest. The Furak moved in silent formation, already beginning to spread out in a hunting pattern they'd clearly used countless times before. Their padded feet made almost no sound as they melted into the underbrush, only the occasional flick of a grey tail visible before they disappeared completely. The Gorah crashed through the underbrush with little attempt at stealth, as if daring the Gronax to confront them directly. Their heavy footfalls crushed the exotic vegetation beneath them, and they periodically fired weapons into the air, whether as intimidation or calibration, Lordar couldn't tell. Unlike the others, the human hadn't immediately plunged into the forest. Instead, he was setting up what appeared to be a small base camp at the edge of the clearing, unpacking equipment from his backpack.
"Aren't you going to be tracking?"
Lordar couldn't help asking, his vocal membranes producing a questioning harmonic. Elias glanced up from where he was programming one of his tiny drones. "I am tracking," he replied, "just not with my feet yet." With a soft whirring sound, 3 of the small devices rose into the air and scattered in different directions over the crimson canopy. The human then calmly unfolded a compact chair, settled into it beneath the shade of a broad-leafed plant, and began studying readings on a small screen.
"But the Gronax,"
Lordar began, his 4 nostrils flaring with concern. "Is big enough to see from the sky," Elias completed the thought, his calm certainty somehow more disquieting than the aggressive confidence of the other hunters. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pouch, extracting something colorful that he popped into his mouth. "Want one? They're called gummy bears. Earth candy." Lordar declined with a confused gesture of his long-fingered hand and retreated back into the ship. As the ramp closed behind him, he caught a final glimpse of the human, reclining comfortably while the galaxy's most dangerous predator roamed somewhere in the forest beyond. Something about the scene left Lordar profoundly unsettled, though he couldn't have articulated why. Perhaps it was the human's apparent lack of urgency, or the strange confidence that seemed unjustified by any observable capability. Whatever the reason, Lordar found himself hoping that when the 3 reconnaissance days ended, all 3 hunting teams would still be intact to present their findings. Somehow, he was already beginning to doubt it. 3 days had passed since the start of the scouting phase, and Lordar's anxiety had only deepened with each passing hour. The cargo bay had been converted into an impromptu presentation space for the hunting teams to demonstrate their elimination strategies. But what should have been a structured council proceeding had developed into chaos before it even began. Egak stood chest to chest with Hatir, a positioning that seemed almost comical given the Furak leader barely reached the middle of the massive Gorah's torso. Yet the canine hunter showed no sign of intimidation, his fur bristling to make himself appear larger as he snarled upwards.
"Your strategy lacks refinement,"
Egak growled, amber eyes flashing with contempt.
"Pack isolation techniques would allow us to separate the Gronax from its territory, creating vulnerability without environmental damage."
Hatir's 4 eyelids blinked asynchronously in what Lordar recognized as the Gorah expression of dismissal.
"Isolation wastes time,"
he rumbled, his tusks clicking together as he spoke.
"Our explosive traps will eliminate the target with 1 detonation. Efficient, certain."
"And destroy half the forest in the process,"
Egak countered. Lordar stepped forward, attempting to reclaim some authority over the proceedings.
"Gentlemen, Perhaps we should wait until...
His words died in his throat as he realized neither hunting party was paying him the slightest attention. A more pressing concern had begun to occupy Lordar's thoughts, however. The human, Elias, had not returned to the ship. In fact, no one had reported seeing him since the second day of the mission, when one of the Furak scouts mentioned glimpsing him near a series of rocky outcroppings, several kilometers from the landing site.
Have either of your teams encountered the human recently?
Lordar asked, raising his voice to be heard over the continuing argument. The human is not our concern, Hatir rumbled, his eyes narrowing, fixed on Igak. Igak's ears flattened against his skull.
My scouts reported tracks 2 days ago, moving deeper into Gronak's territory.
His muzzle pulled back in what might have been a smile, revealing rows of serrated teeth.
Likely he's already food for the beast.
The casual dismissal of the potential casualty sent a wave of anxiety through Lordar's system. Humans were a relatively new member of the Galactic Council, and their diplomatic responses could be as unpredictable as the creatures themselves. If he had to report that they'd lost Earth's hunter on this mission...
Perhaps we should organize a search,
Lordar suggested, his voice rising slightly in pitch.
The council protocols for lost contractors require...
The human knew the risks,
Hatir interrupted, turning his massive body to fully face Lordar for the first time.
We are here to hunt Gronaks, not search for incompetent prey species playing at being predators.
Lordar felt his authority slipping away entirely as the two hunting teams returned to their heated debate about Gronak's elimination strategies, completely ignoring both his diplomatic status and his concerns about the missing human. A deep vibration suddenly ran through the ship beneath his feet. At first, he thought it might be a minor seismic event. Yogana's geologic profile had indicated some tectonic instability, but then came another tremor, stronger this time, accompanied by a strange scratching sound against the outer hull. Both hunting teams immediately fell silent, their evolutionary instincts for detecting danger overriding their competitive posture. Igak's ears swiveled towards the sound, while Hatir's eyes blinked in rapid succession as he processed the potential threat.
Movement outside,
Igak growled softly, his pack already forming a defensive formation around him. Hatir pulled an enormous weapon from his back harness, the metal components sliding and locking into place.
Possibly Gronaks, he said.
Another impact shook the ship, this one powerful enough to send several loose items clattering to the floor. The scratching sound intensified, now accompanied by what sounded disturbingly like massive claws dragging across the hull's exterior plating. In an instant, both hunting teams had weapons ready, their previous argument forgotten in the face of potential danger. They moved towards the cargo bay's exterior door, Igak's pack flowing like water, while the Garra mercenaries created a wall of armored flesh and weaponry. Lordar found himself following reluctantly, his body instinctively trying to make itself smaller even as his diplomatic training demanded he maintain control of the situation. As they approached the exterior door, the scratching sounds grew louder, interspersed with what sounded disturbingly like excited thumping. The security panel beside the door flashed red, indicating an anomalous presence detected outside the hull.
Open it,
Hatir commanded, his massive weapon trained on the door, its powerful cells humming ominously. Before either hunter could implement their strategy, the exterior door's control panel suddenly flashed green, overridden by the ship's primary command codes. The massive cargo door began to descend with a hydraulic hiss, creating a widening gap that admitted Yogana's crimson-tinged sunlight into the dim cargo bay. Every weapon in the room trained on that growing opening. Furak and Garra temporarily united by the prospect of confronting a common threat. Lordar's breath caught in his breathing tubes as a massive shadow fell across the lowering ramp. Through the gap, he could make out an enormous silhouette, wings partially extended, blocking much of the natural light. The ramp completed its descent with a resounding clang that seemed to echo in the perfect silence that had fallen over the assembled hunters. And there, framed in the doorway, sat the Gronax. Lordar nearly fainted at the sight. The creature was even more terrifying in person than in the grainy surveillance footage. Its leathery hide shifted between deep green and midnight black, depending on how the light struck the overlapping scales. Wings partially folded against its massive body still spanned wider than the cargo door itself, the leathery membranes translucent where the sunlight filtered through them. Its elongated head held rows of acid-dripping fangs, each longer than Lordar's forearm, and its eyes gleamed with unmistakable intelligence. But what truly froze Lordar's blood in his veins was the small figure seated comfortably on the creature's back, waving enthusiastically at the assembled hunting parties. "Are you seeing this?" Elias shouted, his face split in a wide grin that displayed his flat, omnivorous teeth. The human bounced slightly in his makeshift saddle secured between two massive dorsal spines. "Are you fucking seeing this?" Lordar's mind struggled to process the impossible image before him. The human, the fragile, clawless, apparently defenseless human, was riding the most dangerous predator on Yogana, as casually as one might ride a domesticated transport animal. The reactions around him were equally stunning. Egak's weapon clattered to the floor from suddenly limp fingers, his muzzle hanging open in a display of shock that transcended species differences. Hatir had taken an involuntary step backward, the first time Lordar had ever seen a Garra retreat from anything. As for Lordar himself, he felt his legs give way beneath him, his slender body folding to the floor as his brain simply refused to maintain the muscle tension necessary for standing. "Isn't he beautiful?" Elias called out, patting the Gronax's neck affectionately. The massive predator responded by turning its head slightly, his eyes regarding the human with what appeared to be, Lordar struggled to identify the emotion, before his brain supplied the impossible answer. Fondness. The human dismounted with ease, sliding down the Gronax's scaled shoulder before landing lightly on the ramp. The creature remained perfectly still during this process, only shifting slightly to provide a better dismounting angle for its rider. "Everyone, meet Fido," Elias announced, stroking the Gronax's lower jaw as if he might be a pet. "Turns out he's extremely intelligent and has quite the sweet tooth." The human reached into his pocket and withdrew a small, brightly colored object, which he tossed into the air. The Gronax's massive head snapped up, catching the tiny morsel between his razor-sharp fangs. Instead of the devastating acid Lordar had expected to see dripping from those fearsome jaws, the creature seemed to be salivating. It made a strange chuffing sound that somehow conveyed pleasure. "Gummy bears," Elias explained, looking inordinately pleased with himself. "He goes crazy for them, even though they're infinitely smaller than him. And beef jerky, too, though I'm almost out of that." Lordar's vocal membranes finally managed to produce sound, though his voice emerged several octaves higher than normal.
You've domesticated the Gronax?"
Elias shrugged, the casual human gesture at odds with the monumental achievement it dismissed. "Not exactly domesticated. We've come to an understanding." He scratched behind a ridge of scales near what might be the creature's ear, causing the massive predator to lean into the touch like an oversized house pet. "Turns out Gronax are a lot like Earth bears. Territorial, apex predators, but surprisingly food-motivated, and much smarter than they look."
"This is impossible,"
Egak finally managed, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Clearly not," Elias replied cheerfully, continuing to stroke the massive predator's scales. "Once I figured out he was attracted to certain scents in my food, it was just a matter of positive reinforcement. A basic animal behavior stuff, really."
"The council directive was to eliminate the threat to the indigenous population,"
Lordar reminded him, having finally regained his voice. And I did, Elias said, his tone suddenly more serious. The threat is eliminated. Fido here won't be hunting near their settlements anymore. We've worked out a new hunting territory for him, farther away from any inhabited areas. Problem solved.
This isn't what the Council ordered,
Lordar insisted, his diplomatic training reasserting itself.
The directive was clear. The Gronax was to be eliminated.
Technically, you ordered the threat to be eliminated, Elias pointed out. What if we relocate the Gronax population instead?
Relocate? The cost would be prohibitive. The Council would never...
Humanity will pay the costs, Elias interrupted, a strange confidence in his voice. Because I was riding a fucking dragon, and everyone will want one too. Lordar's inner eyelids opened and closed rapidly, his brain struggling to process the human's logic.
I don't understand.
It's simple, Elias continued. Humans have a cultural obsession with dragon-like creatures. If I can demonstrate that Gronax can be trained, there will be an enormous interest. Before Lordar could formulate a response to this outlandish proposal, Hetir stepped forward, his massive form casting a shadow over the human. You have deliberately sabotaged our contract, the Garra growled, bony plates shifting along his spine in a display of aggression. The Council hired us to eliminate a threat, not create a tourist attraction for humans. The atmosphere in the cargo bay shifted perceptibly, predatory tension replacing the previous shock and disbelief. Hetir's mercenaries had begun to spread out in a combat formation that sent a chill through Lordar's system.
Hetir!
Egak's voice broke the tense silence.
My team is withdrawing from this contract.
All eyes turned to the wolf-like hunter, whose posture had shifted from aggression to respectfully wary. You abandoned the hunt? Hetir's voice carried equal measures of surprise and contempt.
Among my people, any hunter who can tame dangerous prey is worthy of respect, not challenge.
His ears flattened against his skull in submission, not to Hetir, Lordar realized with shock, but to Elias. Cowards! Hetir spat, the single word loaded with disgust. The movement happened so quickly that Lordar's eyes couldn't track it properly. One moment the standoff continued in tense silence. The next, one of the Garra mercenaries had raised his weapon towards Elias. The Gronax moved with impossible speed for a creature of its size, its massive body interposing between the human and the threat. The horrific roar split the air, so loud that Lordar's sensitive hearing organs registered it as physical pain rather than sound.
Hold your fire,
Lordar screamed, but his diplomatic authority had dissolved completely. 3 more Garra mercenaries raised their weapons, their targeting systems glowing ominously as they locked onto both the human and the Gronax. Elias scrambled up the Gronax's side with a practiced movement, finding handholds among the creature's scales where none should have existed. The massive predator's wings unfurled to their full, terrifying span, the membranes casting dark shadows across the cargo bay.
Get down!
Lordar threw himself behind a stack of supply crates as the air became saturated with weapon fire. The Garra mercenaries had formed a semicircle, their heavy artillery sending pulses of destructive energy toward the ramp where the Gronax now stood fully erect, its eyes blazing with rage. The creature's response defied everything Lordar knew about xenobiology. Instead of fleeing from the overwhelming firepower, it launched itself forward into the barrage, its leathery hide absorbing impacts that should have incinerated flesh on contact. Acid sprayed from its massive jaws in a concentrated stream, striking the nearest Garra mercenary directly in the chest. The scream that followed would haunt Lordar's dreams for years to come. The acid ate through the Garra's protective armor in seconds, then through flesh and bone with equal hunger. Where a towering mercenary had stood, only a smouldering, half-dissolved heap remained. Fall back! Regroup! Hatir's voice boomed over the cacophony of weapon fire and roaring beast. His mercenaries attempted to establish a defensive perimeter, but the confined space of the cargo bay limited their tactical options. Meanwhile, Elias had maneuvered himself into position on the Gronax's back, braced between two massive dorsal spines. Lordar watched in disbelief as the human drew his single, seemingly inadequate rifle and began returning fire with remarkable precision. The weapon's report was almost lost amid the chaos, but its effects were unmistakable. One Garra staggered backward, clutching at a wound where his eye had been. The Gronax moved with lethal grace, its massive tail sweeping across the bay floor, sending two mercenaries flying into the metal bulkhead with bone-crushing force. Its wings, partially extended in the confined space, created gusts of air that scattered equipment and disrupted the Garra's aim. Lordar pressed himself deeper into his inadequate cover as the crossfire intensified. Energy bolts ricocheted off metal surfaces, creating a lethal lattice of destructive force. Through a gap in the crates, he could see Egak and his pack huddled near the exit, clearly unwilling to join either side of the conflict. The battle's turning point came when the Gronax took to the air, leaving the cargo bay and then bathing the ramp and everyone in it in acid. The sounds that followed, rendering flesh, snapping bones, guttural screams, made Lordar's delicate inner ears throb with sympathetic pain. Acid sprayed in all directions as the Gronax shook its massive head, dissolving equipment, melting through metal flooring, and reducing one unfortunate mercenary to unrecognizable organic slurry. The reek of chemical dissolution and charred flesh filled the air, overwhelming Lordar's sensitive olfactory receptors and sending him into a coughing fit that threatened to reveal his location. Through watering eyes, Lordar saw Hatir charge the Gronax, trying to hit Elias instead of the beast. The Gronax roared and returned to the ground, jaws snapping at the attacker. Hatir barely avoided the first bite, losing a section of shoulder plate to razor-sharp teeth, but the second attack connected, massive jaws closing around the Garra's weapon arm with a sickening crunch. From his position atop the creature, Elias continued to provide covering fire, methodically eliminating the remaining mercenaries who still posed a threat. His expression had changed completely. Gone was the cheerful, almost naive demeanor, replaced by a cold focus that seemed to transform his unremarkable features into something predatory.
"Stop! Enough!"
Lordar finally found the courage to emerge from hiding, his diplomatic thinking overriding his survival instincts.
"This slaughter serves no purpose."
For a moment, it seemed his plea might be ignored. The Gronax had pinned Hatir to the deck, massive jaws poised for a killing strike. Acid dripped from its fangs onto the Garra leader's armor, slowly eating through the protective plating. Then, miraculously, Elias spoke a single word, a sharp command in what must have been an Earth language. The Gronax froze mid-strike, its eyes swiveling toward its rider. "That's enough, boy," Elias said, his voice unnervingly calm amid the carnage. "We don't want to get you in trouble with the Council." It took some convincing, but the Gronax reluctantly released its prey, stepping back from the wounded Garra leader. Hatir lay gasping on the deck, his once impressive bone armor dissolved in patches, green blood seeping from multiple wounds. Lordar surveyed the devastation with mounting horror. Half the cargo bay lay in ruins, equipment destroyed, deck plating corroded, and the remains of Garra mercenaries scattered in various states of dissolution. The diplomatic incident this would create was beyond calculation. "This," Elias said quietly, patting the Gronax's neck as it settled back into its haunches, "was unfortunate." One standard year had passed since the incident on Yogana. Lordar sat in his office on the Council core planet, surrounded by the elegant but sterile architecture that categorized all administrative buildings in the capital. The morning light filtered through the polarized windows, casting regular patterns across his desk where several data terminals displayed various reports requiring his attention. His hands still trembled slightly whenever his thoughts turned to the Gronax. The diplomatic fallout from the incident had been substantial. The Garra Mercenary Guild had filed formal complaints, demanding reparations, and threatened to sever ties with the council entirely. Months of delicate negotiations had finally resulted in a settlement, though the cost to the council's treasury had been considerable. The human, Elias Garcia, had faced a tribunal for his actions. Lordar had testified, recounting the events as accurately as his still traumatized memory allowed. Surprisingly, the verdict had been not guilty on all charges, the tribunal accepting the human's claim of self-defense against Garra aggression. Lordar's inner eyelids opened and closed as he remembered the human's calm demeanor throughout the proceedings, so at odds with the devastation he had witnessed on Yogana. The contrast troubled him still. Absent-mindedly, he rotated his primary finger through the holographic menu of his terminal, scrolling through routine reports without really seeing them. A nagging curiosity had been growing in him for weeks now. What had become of the Gronax? What had happened on Yogana after the council hastily closed the matter? With a quick glance to ensure his privacy, Lordar entered his administrative override codes, accessing restricted databases not typically available to diplomats of his rank. He justified the minor transgression as necessary for comprehensive situation assessment, a phrase vague enough to avoid scrutiny in the system logs. His search parameters were simple: Gronax plus Yogana plus relocation. The terminal quickly processed the query, accessing archives across multiple secure networks. When the results appeared, Lordar's breathing tubes constricted in shock. His elongated fingers trembled as he expanded the first data file, then the second, then a dozen more in rapid succession. The screens filled with images that defied comprehension. Thousands of Gronax, not just the single specimen from Yogana, but an entire species transplanted to a previous uninhabited world now designated New Draconius. Humans in specialized protective gear working alongside the massive predators, juvenile Gronax being hand-fed by human children. But most astonishing of all, a promotional video for something called Kingdom of Dragons Adventure Resort. The footage showed sprawling facilities built to accommodate visitors from across the galaxy, though the only visitors he saw in the footage were humans. They visited observation platforms overlooking Gronax nesting grounds, and most incredibly, humans mounted on specifically equipped saddles, riding adult Gronax through crimson-tinted skies. The video transitioned to scenes of long queues, tourists from dozens of human colonies waiting for their chance to interact with the fearsome creatures. Lordar sat back in his chair, the specialized fluid in his joints shifting to accommodate his suddenly limp posture. The human had been right. His incomprehensible statement, "They will because I'm riding a fucking dragon and everyone will want one too," had proven prophetically accurate. The final image on the screen showed a human child, no more than 7 or 8 years old by Lordar's estimation, seated confidently on the back of a juvenile Gronax. Both child and beast appeared utterly at ease, engaged in what seemed to be a training exercise in a specifically designed arena. Understanding dawned on Lordar with crystal clarity. The physically unimpressive, evolutionary unremarkable humans possessed an ability that no other council species had fully appreciated. They could form bonds with apex predators, transforming natural enemies into allies. With trembling fingers, Lordar opened a new search window. He hesitated only briefly before typing, "Kingdom of Dragons, Vacation Packages." As the results populated his screen, he felt a confusing mixture of lingering fear and growing fascination. Perhaps, he thought, it was time to see these domesticated Gronax for himself.